Yeah, as we said, welcome to our Sumérgete this month. We've had this series monthly since the pandemic started. It kind of forced us to do this, but it's been a joy to get to see many of you each month and to get to have different speakers that speak that talk about such important subjects each month. Just to remind you, next month we're going to have a conversation with Daniel Camacho, who used to be editor at Sojourners, about the role of public theology from the Latinx perspective. That will be November 23rd, same time at 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern time. If you can make it, you can always, still register for the event. You'll receive the video afterward. And also you can follow us on Facebook to maintain, we will share all the information there. I would like to let Alma, if you wanted to say some welcoming words, the director of our Hispanic House of Studies.
Yeah, yes, as you said, welcome everyone. We are so happy to, I say, have you here because it seems like we are in the same place. I think it's the Holy Spirit that unites us, even though we are so far away, some of us from each other. And thank you so much to Yolanda, Victoria, and Ali for sharing about your experience, both in the church and in the academy. We are so happy to have you here and so honored to know you and know that you are doing amazing ministry in the academy and in the church. So thank you so much for giving us your time. I know you are so busy also writing and reading and everything else. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alma. So yeah, we'll go ahead and start with our conversation. I'm gonna briefly, in Spanish, gonna switch to Spanish right now to just let people know about our translation options. So if you can bear with me just for a minute. Bienvenidos a todos. Si es que hablan español y necesitan traducción, por favor elijan abajo en el menú. Deben ver una opción que dice interpretación en español, o si tienen el Zoom en inglés, interpretation. Ahí háganle clic y elijan la opción en español, lo que los llevará al traductor que tenemos para este evento. Muchas gracias. Okay, great. So we can start our conversation. We're going to start just as a discussion about many questions that we have, and then we'll open the floor for some questions that you may have. So as Yolanda and Victoria and Ali share their experiences, if a question pops up, feel free to either write it out in the chat or keep it in mind for the end, and we'll make sure to ask those questions at the end as we have time. So yeah, again, I want to welcome Yolanda, Ali, and Victoria for being here. And I just want to start with giving them a little bit of space to introduce themselves, tell us where are they coming from, a little bit of like their church background, what they're studying at the university that they're at presently, things like that. So Yolanda, would you mind starting us?
Okay, not at all. Hi, everybody. My name is Yolanda Santiago Correa. I am originally from Puerto Rico. I was born and raised on the island, and I moved to the U.S. at 21 to go to Duke. So my MDiv is from Duke, and I am happy to join you here today. What is my background? I'm an only child and the child of 2 ordained ministers with the Methodist Church of Puerto Rico. So I'm a PK, what you would call in English a PK. And that framed my experience of the church. I still am affiliated to the United Methodist Church here. And my parents have since 2018 moved to Austin, which is where I am right now. And my mom is pastoring a church here in Texas. And I'm a third-year PhD student at Southern Methodist University, which is in Dallas, in religion and culture, specifically exploring the intersections of Latinidad and Blackness and the Afro-Latino identity. And so that informs my life, my everyday practice, and it's also informed by my experience as in the church, growing up as the child of 2 pastors. I don't know if you want me to say more, Kat, or just leave it.
No, that was perfect. No, that's perfect. Welcome, Yolanda. It's good to have you here. Victoria, would you like to share with us next?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you also for having me. My name is Victoria Perez Rivera. I am currently at the University of Southern California. I am starting my second year in the PhD program in religion with a focus on New Testament, early Christianity, and MTS from Duke as well. So I know Yolanda from there, and I had the pleasure of meeting Ali recently. So it's a pleasure to be here. My church background is I grew up in Anaheim, California. My church was literally a few streets down from Disneyland. So we saw the fireworks every Friday night service, which was fun. It's an Assemblies of God church. It's called Centro Cristiano La Roca. It's a first generation, primarily immigrant Spanish speaking church. That's where I grew up. For those of you who are familiar with the Pentecostal tradition, I grew up with those 4-hour services, all night vigilias, shoes coming off, dancing in the spirit type of thing, if anyone's familiar with that. So that was my church background. And currently, me and my partner are still serving in that context. And that's a journey, that's been a journey in itself. So hopefully we'll be able to touch on some of those things. But yeah, so that's where we're at currently.
Thank you, Victoria. Welcome. We love to have you here. Ali, would you like to be next?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all for having me in this space. It's an honor to be here. The identities that have most formed me and shaped me are that of being a daughter of Mexican migrant parents. And I will own that forever and ever, even as situations change in my life. I was raised in various Christian traditions, actually. My mom was in a deep search and longing to know God. And so, but eventually we landed and anchored down at the Seventh-day Adventist faith tradition. Through the Adventist institutions, I was trained and I got my master's in clinical ministry. By vocation, I am a chaplain. I did my residency at UCLA Medical Center as well, and have been in chaplaincy since 2009. So it's also very formative in who I am and what I do. Currently a 4th-year student at Vanderbilt University, a student of practical theology, with the aims of, in my dissertation, to look at pastoral care responses that tend to Latinx LGBTQI+ community members, as I identify as one as well. And I'm looking for what tools do we have for sexual identity transformation in the academy, but especially in the church and among Latinx families.
Wow, that's great. Thank you, Ali. So I hear that in all of these little bits and pieces that you share with us about your background and especially your experience growing up in the church, seems like the church has been so influential in your call to the academy and in your call to what you're currently doing and what you're currently passionate about there. So I guess I wanted to follow up with the question of what do you think has been the role of the church community, right? As you were sharing these church communities that you've grown up in, whether that's one church or in the case of Ali, you were saying like various denominations, right? What has been the role of the church community in inspiring you to, pursue these doctoral degrees in theological studies, but also just inspiring you to do the work that you do, whether it's inside the academy or outside in that community? And I guess with that, perhaps it's a two-part question. How is it that relationship, right, and what you bring of your experience in these specific communities, how has it inspired your study and the research you're currently doing? We can start the other way around. If you want to start, Ali, would that be okay? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very important question. Thank you so much for it. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, and taken back to Mexico shortly after birth. And then it wasn't until I was 6 years old that I arrived back to the US. And that when migrant community members come into a land where there's a new language, the church becomes central to a sense of continuity of their identity. You know, when there's so much absence of culture from the homelands that we're uprooted from, there has to be a space somewhere, right? Add to that you're undocumented, and you know, workplaces or educational spaces don't exist for parents, right? And so church is the educational center, church is the community center, church is everything. And it is in that context that I was framed really in my own theological thoughts. And the tension that I experienced there, though, is that for as much as it became the space where that taught us everything, the space where community was accessible, a continuity of self was also there. As I was exploring my own identity, or this one aspect of my identity in terms of my sexual orientation, it did not have a space for me any longer. And so the question then began, how is it possible that a place that can do so much in terms of holding me, uplifting me and my family, keeping us together, is also not creating, let's just say, enough space for me to question, for me to be able to also see myself not as a sin, but also as a daughter of God? And that is a question that continued to lead me. The church is also framing in a very ironic way, in that when you're young, you're always asked and encouraged to participate, you know, whether it's, you know, read the Bible passage, offer prayer, you know, join one of the drama skits for today, join the play. It's so much encouragement, and you start building your own leadership skills that you don't even know is happening, but you're being also framed as a leader. To then, in the Seventh-day Adventist faith in 2005, say there is a ruling or a vote against women's ordination, it shakes you to your core. When I opened the email, when I received the announcement, I was actually functioning as a director in an MS chaplaincy program at Loma Linda University, which is an Adventist church. So imagine how having all of these doors open within the tradition, and then this statement that says, actually, no, you can only go so far, right? So there's I think a wrestling that the church is going through, and that I believe we need more resources and a broader conversation on. And that's what led me into the academy. It has provided a space for me to be able to ask these questions.
Thank you, Ali. You've shared so much with us. Yeah, I would like to give some space for Yolanda. Would you like to share next with us about?
Yes. So like I said, I grew up in Puerto Rico, and so my experience is a little different because I didn't arrive at the context of the United States until I was basically an adult. And so the experience there was my mom became a pastor first when I was 5, and then my dad didn't become a pastor until later. But the fact that I was an only child, and that it was my mother, the one who was a pastor, started the framing of my identity and my sort of dreams, because I saw the way that my mom was treated as a woman in a position of power in the church, and as a visibly Afro-descendant person in Puerto Rico. And so it was both the experience of being in the church and seeing our experience as a family. For those of you that are not Methodist and might not know, Methodist itinerate. And in the case of Puerto Rico, it's whatever city you are sent to. So I think I lived in 5 different cities across my life. And so that framed my identity, and it framed my thoughts, because I started seeing all of these experiences of my parents as leaders of the church, and all of the expectations that were placed as me as part of the pastoral family, even though I wasn't a pastor. And so all of these pressures and sort of all of these comments and all of the expectations that surrounding me, I think created in me a very a prowess for academic achievement, because it was always sort of my responsibility to give example and be the example for the other kids of the church. And I think that expectation and sort of that formation as part of that pastoral family is what eventually led to some of my questioning, what Ali was mentioning, and some of my own challenging of the church. And that was because I was experiencing the church experiencing the church as a member, but also I was seeing all of the sort of behind the scenes happening of what the church is behind just a regular service or just sitting in the pews. And so I guess if I could phrase it in a simple way, I was experiencing all of the ugly parts of the church. And that led to me asking a lot of questions about many things. And then eventually I started studying music. So in seventh grade, I believe, I was accepted into the music school in Puerto Rico, and I started studying percussion. In the case of percussion in Puerto Rico, that has a very strong tie to our African roots. And so the knowledge of that environment with the church, all of it, I guess, paired. And so then I started asking the questions about how we, in a sense, perform church. So why do we use the music that we do? Why is the iconography of God or Jesus as it is? The color of his skin, the languaging that we use, all of these things. And when I started noticing that there was a gap and that these questions were welcomed in my house, with two parents who are also holders of an MDiv, but were not welcome in the general church environment, I started noticing, oh, wait, there's something else to be said here. And then eventually I landed at Duke. And when I started having the experience of living as a member of the diaspora in the United States, that also added to that experience, where my experience in the church was that there is a very, I guess, model or look of what a Latino church or ministry looks like that didn't necessarily fit what I knew and what my experience as a Puerto Rican woman was. And so that in the church and then in the academy, noticing that it was the case for Latino theology as well, made me then become curious and landed me to being a third year studying religion and culture and Blackness in Latin America. And so I guess that experience as a 5-year-old coming into the role of being part of a pastoral family and sort of being put in the public eye and the expectations, together with all of these other experiences that I've narrated, were really influential in not only forming who I was and who I am, but also forming a lot of the questions that frame the work that I'm doing right now.
Thank you, Yolanda. Victoria?
Yeah, so my story echoes Yolanda's in many ways. And I think, yeah, I hear so many continuities between our stories. My parents are also pastors. So I also grew up under, the very watchful eye of the church. And so I completely relate with that whole idea of having to, be an example to all the other kids and youth out there. And so, I slept under the benches at church when service went long. I mean, my whole life was just suffused through and through with church, with ministry. I would watch my parents interact with, hermanos y hermanas, and lead them and guide them through issues of immigration, through issues of, family. Just, I saw the church's ins and outs as well. And I actually had a very different experience in that a lot of PKs, I think, get really hit hard with the brunt of the ugliness of church. And a lot of them, for very, understandable reasons, leave. And I think my experience was different in that, first of all, I credit the people of the church who, are people as well, but they tended to be very supportive. And so for my educational goals, you had kind of two camps. You had the people that would say, ooh, mija, be careful, la mucha letra mata, right? So using Paul's verse about the spirit gives life, but the letter kills. So they had this idea that the more I read, the more I would stray from God. And then you had the other people that were like, awesome, go for it. What's a PhD? I don't even know, but it sounds cool, go for it. So you kind of had those two camps, but I remember growing up, I wasn't really allowed to read Harry Potter. So for me, this magical world that I would read was the book of Revelation. And I would read, Bible stories. And I was just, from very early on, being in a Protestant tradition where scripture is held at a very high place, I had a lot of questions, even as a young kid. My father is, I would watch him study for his Sunday sermons, just completely devouring the scripture. I would see him at the dinner table and I would have questions. And I was like, what is he reading? What could he be reading that is so, that has him here every Sunday or every Saturday night studying? And so I began to read through his commentaries in his garage where he had a little makeshift library. And I started reading and I started getting into the scripture for myself at a very early age, around the age of 12. I had already started to read, cover to cover the Bible, and I had a lot of questions. So I would dialogue with my father and I would ask him, why this? Or how come in Chronicles there's discrepancies? Here it says this, but here it says this. How do you explain that? And so from an early age, he would answer my questions. He would try to help me reconcile in some ways until there came a point where I realized his knowledge also hit a ceiling. He has a third grade education, Mexican, immigrant. So he gave me what he could, but there was a point in which I knew I needed to learn for myself. And so when I went to Bible school at the age of 17, I was in a phase of like trying to prove my faith, right? Apologetics and that whole deal. So I was like, I need to give a response and an answer. So I just dove even deeper. And so the deeper I dove, the more questions I had. And then I started to take on a more academic approach to the Bible, not so much distancing myself, because I think what Latino theology taught me, Latinx theology taught me, is how to view myself as part of the text. And it was hermeneutic that I knew from growing up in a Pentecostal church, right? You read the Exodus and like, those are your people. It's not just a story. And so I was very familiar with that hermeneutic and I related a lot, but there came a point in which I needed answers for myself. I didn't find the answers. In fact, I'm still searching. So that's what's led me here to my second year of the PhD, where I'm still studying the Bible and realizing that maybe it's not this answer book that I thought it would be, or this, all the other things that I grew up thinking it was. But I'm very lucky to say that many people are still supportive. A lot of people, I think, don't understand sometimes what I'm doing. But I think the fact that I'm still connected has helped. So I'm able to kind of hold both in tension, very much in tension, because there are often ways that both of these parts of my life cannot speak to each other. So I'm currently living in that dissonance of how do I bring my questions to a community that is not even really thinking of these questions because they're literally trying to live day to day. So it's been interesting and it's been a struggle, but I think the church has walked alongside me through it all, even to now. So I'm very lucky to say that I do feel like I have a community that is behind me, whether or not they understand what it is exactly I'm doing. So that's my story there.
Thank you, Victoria, so much for sharing with us, and Yolanda and Ali. I see kind of like a theme emerge from a lot of right, there's either the wrestling that we keep talking about, and also the question of Victoria, I think you put it so well, how to bring back to the church kind of what we're learning and the transformation that's happening in these academic spaces. And Ali, I loved how you described this kind of wrestling with, you use the language of the church being a place that kind of holds us so much, like makes so much of who we are, yet doesn't always welcome everything that we are, it seems, right? Like, and there's that like wrestling. So I guess I was wondering, in that case, right, since we carry these complexities, this complex wrestling with our backgrounds or the church, how do you see yourself bringing the church with all these complexities with you to these academic spaces? Or I guess vice versa as well, as Victoria was saying, how do you see yourself then bringing these things that you're learning in the academic spaces back to your local church that you're connected to? Like, how have you seen that? How challenging has that proved to be? Yeah, just let's just kind of start with that. Yolanda, would you like to start us?
Of course. That's such a complicated question, and I think I have so many different ways that I could go. But I think what has worked for me in both is to avoid code switching. So there's this really popular sort of practice, especially in the United States, with people who come from minoritized communities, of doing something called code switching, which is sort of the code of my house, and how I speak in my house and how I am is for my house. And then when I go into a space like the academy specifically, I change to fit in, or to better speak to the persons who don't come from my background, who are not like me. But although I'm very good at it, I quickly figured out that what that was doing is that it was furthering that gap. It was making that gap wider and wider, making the chasm wider and wider, because then I was unable to bring what I was doing here back here, if here is home or church and here is academy, because I wasn't even using the same language, and so I wasn't even being the same person. So it was very difficult for me to translate back and forth what was happening, and what I could say. And so for me, I think the first step was being unapologetically Puerto Rican, in the academy, with all of the effects that that brings. Because then, as I'm studying it, who I am and the church that formed me, that nurtured me, that also hurt me in many ways, is constantly in conversation with everything that I'm doing. And so as I'm writing, as I'm reading, as I'm discussing in class, Puerto Rico and the church and my experiences are always there. And so I think it has been of utmost importance to me to make sure that I'm always bringing myself into the spaces, and intentionally, in fact, going as far as being disruptive of the spaces. Because I think it goes without saying that the academic world, especially at the level of PhD, is very white and very dominated by white voices, and also male voices, which is another experience that I'm sure Ali and Victoria could speak to as well. And so me being a Puerto Rican woman, an Afro-Latina who speaks Spanish as her first language, coming into the space, as a young woman who's unmarried, doesn't have children, which is not very common, or at least not what the, I guess, cultural or social agreement around women and the role of women is, definitely placed a challenge for me navigating the academic space. But at the end, it has been very useful to me to then be able to bring it back home. Because then as I'm having this conversation, if I'm keeping myself and my experience in mind, then I can come back and sit with my parents and be like, hey, I heard about this today, or I was talking about this. And further impact, as in Puerto Rico, it's what I post on Facebook or Instagram. And that sometimes my grandmother will call my mom and be like, ¿Qué le pasa a Yolandita? Like, she has gone off her rails. Like, this is so bad. But it has also opened conversation. And so I think keeping that in mind always, and keeping that tension alive, and not sort of succumbing to, okay, I'm a member of the academy now and I can never go back, or these people are never going to understand, or they like that, not succumbing to that thought, and making it an intentional part of my work to constantly be in that back and forth, and to constantly both bring the academy to home in a language that's understandable for those that are not in the academy, and but also inserting home into the academy and intentionally disrupting what says that me or our people are not to exist, or cannot understand, or don't have the ability to, I guess, how can I phrase it? Se me está yendo el inglés. To walk into the academy and to be in those spaces, and to be interlocutors. Because I think one of the things, and Victoria spoke a little bit about it, one of the things that I learned from Latino theology, this whole idea of en conjunto, en lo cotidiano, the daily experience, the day-to-day, and en conjunto, the thinking together, I think is also what forms my work, is knowing that my ideas don't only come from me, but they come from that church and that background. And so I owe something to them, because I wouldn't be where I am today if there wasn't a church that formed me and supported me, but also that in a way was part of creating the questions that I now have. And so I think keeping that tension alive, even as difficult as it is, because it is a very hard task to do. And most of the time I want to surrender to one of the two and just leave it all behind. I think it's key in making sure that both the church and the academy continue in conversation, not only through me, but also through the work of my peers as well.
Yeah, thank you, Yolanda, for speaking to that specifically, about how necessary it is to relate to both in the same level, but also, thinking of how exhausting that is to do that constantly. Ali, would you like to say a little bit about the question?
Absolutely. So how do I see myself bringing the church into the academy? I think the simplest way I can answer this is that it is with me like a plague. It never leaves me. And I think it's particularly of how we're framed inside the church that it is a very dualistic space. Again, speaking, maybe it reaches to other denominations represented here today, but in the Adventist church, you know, especially a church that's very uh, adamant about the eschatology and end times. It's about doing right versus not doing right. It's about evil and it's about goodness. It's about doing God's will or falling outside of God's will. It's this dualistic space, right? The beauty in that is that it does present you as a congregant with the question of what are your values? You know, where do they lie? And then it invites you to live accordingly. I think that's great. But when you frame everything, all of the complexities about our being, about our existence, about lived experience, then it's not so black and white, right? Then it's a really gray area where the answers are just not as simple as let's give it to God, let's pray. You know, there's so much more that goes into paying attention to mind, body, spirit, psychological, emotional, spiritual well-being, that sometimes church leaders who we often go to are limited in their capacity to be able to respond. So there's something to say about that. And for as much as I would love to say that as I've been formed in academic spaces, that I've been able to integrate the church and what I've learned from the church in this space, it hasn't been easy. As a matter of fact, I've had to pause the church because for every issue that I try to tackle in the academy, if this binary is still with me, if this yes or no, what does the church say, what does it not say, I could never provide myself the space to consider something outside of what I've been presented with, which in the church, unfortunately, has been limited. And I think it's because the church has also this mission to guard truth. However it is that the community represented in these church spaces has agreed that truth looks like and is, right? And so it's been really challenging. I've had to pause it. I particularly, if I could offer one quick example, when I started in healthcare chaplaincy, I was in charge of the NICU, and oftentimes we would see loss of newborns, and we would find that families represented, like particularly Christian families, would ask for a infant baptism. Now, here's what happens. I show up, according to the Seventh-day Adventist traditions, we don't believe in infant baptism. So I'm not qualified, so to speak, because it's not my faith, it's not my belief. But here is a mother who has lost her child. How do I deny her that? So then I think to myself, well, if I can't do it, maybe I'll reach out to someone who can. Okay, in Catholicism, priests do offer infant baptism. Great. Let me reach out to the priest. What does the priest say? Sacraments are for the living and not for the dead. And here's this mother asking for a ritual, you know, that honors her belief in God and her belief that even through this, everything will be okay, and that God will be guiding and with her. And so these sacraments, these rituals, these traditions, they're important to hold. So here's a circumstance in which she needs it, right? And essentially, we can't offer it. Within the church, absolutely not. And there will be, you could be reprimanded. There are high consequences for offering this, but I couldn't deny that, right? And so I had to learn how to deconstruct my theology and rebuild it in light of that same question that the church posed to me. What are your values? And how do you live and act accordingly? My values are those of justice. And if that mother needed this ritual, then we are going to find a way to do this. And so this is just one example that I hope illustrates just how difficult it is to navigate and integrate both spaces, but not impossible.
Wow, Ali, thank you. I feel like you just preached so much there. I may need like a breather to like think about, I'm gonna listen to this again to be able to like think about that. Wow, thank you for sharing. Victoria?
Yeah, Ali, thank you so much. Just hearing that story, I'm reminded of all the times as well, you know, in the church that there are moments where you need to reevaluate, like, yeah, what are your values and how are they serving the people, the common, you know, the common good? It's such a fascinating question. Um, with that idea of bringing the church into an academic space, I think it's been challenging. And currently, the institution that I'm at now is it's USC, so it's a private research institution, and it's actually, as I was kind of doing an inventory of my life and my educational experience, it's actually the first institution. I don't know if this is, I mean, tragic or not, but the first institution that I'm at that's not denominational or confessional in any way. So here I am doing a PhD in an institution where it's religion proper, not theology, not you know, anything like that. So having to navigate this new stage of my academic journey has proved even more challenging than previous years where I was in seminary or in Bible school. But one moment I particularly remember is it was after I came home from seminary. So I was in North Carolina for 2 years and learning all the things, and my head was just inflating every day. And then I came home and I was having a discussion with my grandma. And I remember we were arguing over some text. I think it was an eschatological text as well, especially in these moments, political, you know, times that everyone's talking about eschatological things. So we were arguing about something, and I was trying to, in a sense, prove her wrong, and show her that she wasn't, you know, performing a correct reading of the text, etc. And I remember she looked me in the eyes and she told me, "I'm not dumb." And that moment like shook me, because here I was, you know, a 20-something-year-old talking to my grandma who has lived already many lifetimes. And I remember that moment so clearly because I thought to myself, wow, I really missed the mark here. In trying to prove her wrong, in trying to show her that her whole faith system was on, you know, shifting sand, I really missed the mark on what it means to love God and love your neighbor. And I think I was more concerned with this whole rightness. Of course, being a biblical scholar of the bunch, the field of biblical studies is very Eurocentric. It's very much about the right interpretation. As we all know, there really is none. So I started with this whole idea of, what does the Bible say? How can we use all the different contexts to find the right meaning and exegete the right meaning out? So beginning in that, and then transitioning, you know, through many years of realizing that my interpretations really were not those interpretations that I was reading in the multiple commentaries that I was studying day in and day out. So in the academy, I found more and more that I would get frustrated with a lot of the steps for biblical interpretation that I was reading and studying, and then even later teaching, to where I realized, what am I'm teaching, you know, for example, a group of young Latino students, this is how you interpret a text, and here's the right way to get a text that really was divorced from any meaning for the community itself. And so coming home after seminary, back to Southern California, back to a community that really did not care what I was doing over there. They just really were more concerned with the state of my spiritual life or whatever it may be. But it was kind of this coming back to a theology that had legs for me. So it was this idea that I was getting like this heady theology, but I would come home to a theology with legs. So kind of what Yolanda was sharing, I definitely identify as well. Of I had to learn that I cannot be two different people in those spaces. I had to learn to hold those both in tension. And so being in the church on the opposite end, with also this idea that I'm a member of the academy, is also very difficult in the sense that, you know, I feel like I'm bouncing off of Ali and Yolanda a lot here, but I think I relate a lot that sometimes there's no space for those questions. And because there are very real situations and there are very real moments that the congregants are having, they don't really necessarily, there's not always the time to ask, you know, these very like esoteric questions about life and God and whatever it may be. So it's difficult, especially in a Pentecostal church. So if anyone's familiar, experience is elevated to a very high level. And so there isn't always a concern with a right meaning or things that a biblical scholar would be concerned with. So it's been definitely difficult to try to bring both of those identities into one another. But I think over time, I'm trying to figure out how I can do it and be present with all of the complexities of identity in both of those spaces. And I can't say I've found the right way to do it yet, but I am working through it day to day and trying to be the best version of myself, the same version of myself, just in those different spaces, which is hard. And this may lead us to the next question, but how do you exist in all of who you are in a place where you're already a minority? You're a person of color, you're a woman. And in my case, I'm a mother of a 6-month-old, I'm a pastor's daughter. So all of these different things that are like, you know, a lot of times I found myself the only person of color and woman in my biblical studies classes. So that was really difficult. And I always felt definitely like an outsider to the guild. So yeah, it's definitely been challenging to bring myself into both of those spaces in all of who I am in the presence of those spaces. But I think little by little I'm trying to figure it out. Yeah. So.
No, I think we're all trying to figure it out. Victoria is like the constant thing of like of again. I think, right, I see two great points that are coming from everything that you three have shared, is both how in the academic spaces our experiences like from the community, they're not welcomed there, right? Like, and you sit in these classes which you are like, I want to bring this that makes me, and you find kind of like a wall there, like a kind of like column, right, that's saying no. And on the other end is going back to your community and saying, okay, how do I bring here these questions and this wrestling that I'm doing in academic spaces, right? So maybe in like parting these in two, we can talk about first maybe the challenges in the academy, and then perhaps do the other of the challenges of going back to the community as a, you know, emerging scholar or something like that. So I guess that's all to say. My next question kind of just focuses on thinking about the challenges in the academy and in university spaces. I think as Yolanda was, and all of you have actually noted that you have specific challenges in these spaces because of your identity as Latinx, but also as women, right? Like that's a specific challenges that you carry there. So I guess I was just wanting to expand a little bit on like what have been the challenges specifically as a Latina woman in these academic spaces that, as we all know, and I am just reiterating, I think what I've heard here is too that these spaces are not often built for us, right? And it feels like we are often trying to assert our right over and over again to be in these spaces. How have you particularly faced these challenges? If anyone wants to start, volunteer, or I can choose someone. All right, I'll just choose Yolanda. Go ahead.
Okay, challenges, wow. There's been a lot of crying. I'll start it out with that, a lot of tears. I think that the challenge of the academic space for me is multi-level. I think it began very much by the fact that most of my schooling was done in Spanish. So I grew up in Puerto Rico. My school era en español. My undergrad was in Spanish, and although my English is very good, and I was very proficient in it, and I even spent a couple of years of my elementary schooling in a private school in Puerto Rico that taught in English. Spanish was still what I was used to. It was still the way that I approached studying. It was what I was reading most of the time. And so I think even before PhD, just walking into Duke and walking into a lecture room, for those that are Dukies, 0016, and just being confronted by this huge room where the professor is like spewing a bunch of language, very academic language in English, and suddenly I'm like, wait, this is not what I'm used to. Just that was a challenge, because I always felt like I was behind, because even though I was understanding, my brain was constantly like trying to translate back and forth, and even speaking, just like right now, even 5 years later, it happens. Eventually my brain almost short circuits and it wants to default back to Espanol, and I can't. And so I think that just out of the gate was one of the first challenges that immediately put me outside. Like I immediately noticed, oh, this is not for me. I don't belong here. And then as a young person, so I came to Duke at 21. I graduated. So by the time that I started my PhD, I was 24. I'm the youngest in my cohort and one of the youngest in the program. So just being a young person as well was very challenging, especially because a lot of the faculty and even some of my peers doubted my ability to exist in the space just because I'm a young person. And so there's always questioning of, you haven't lived enough, you're still too young. I've gotten a lot of jokes about being a millennial and somebody who grew up on social media. You people don't understand sort of things like that. And so that has been a huge challenge, especially when it comes to faculty and staff, because I've experienced a lot of paternalism and a lot of, oh, I want to, I could be your grandpa or I could be your mom, but you're not. But it's been sort of that constant wrestling with that. And then as a woman and a woman of color, that also has been a challenge because as I mentioned briefly before, as a Latina, and I think it happens for Puerto Rico and many other Latinx nations, there's an expectation of what womanhood looks like. And it doesn't look like being single at 26 with no children in a PhD program. And so as the first person that's going to get a PhD in my family, and as a young woman who's prioritizing my work and my career over sort of the family life that is expected of women, of Latina women and a lot of Latina women in the church, there has been a huge challenge on that. And as Victoria mentioned, I was often one of two women in the room. So I've had the experience of peers screaming at me or belittling me, mansplaining, all of that experience. And then for me in particular, a little story, there's one other Latina in our program who's a fifth year, and she's from Cuba. And ever since I came my first year, nobody ever knows I'm me. And so I'm constantly being called her name, which it sounds like a very dumb experience, but it really is something that hurts to the core, because you sort of lose your identity for this sort of, oh, Grace is also Latina and from the Caribbean. So there's sort of this mixing and this erasing to, because y'all have curly hair and are not white, you must be the same person. And so it's been a really hard experience to confront, having the courage to stand up for myself in front of my peers, in front of professors who question my intelligence. So I had the experience of a professor saying, oh, it's just that you people, the culture people, you don't understand what's happening, or it's a philosophy class. And I'm not sure that you're going to be able to pass because I don't think you have the experience or the ability to understand these terms and these theories we're discussing. And so just the challenge of PhD, sorry about the dogs, just the challenge of PhD is enough. Just the academic load is crazy. So just that is enough. And then putting on top of that, being a woman, being a young person, being single, all of the things that I mentioned before, and being of color, it just makes it even worse. And so there's been a lot of crying, a lot of wanting to give up, and a lot of doing what we're doing right now, bouncing back and forth between other people and hearing their experience to be able to have the courage to survive it. And I think at the end of the day, it's wanting others who look like me, who are younger, to not experience some of these things. That is the only reason that has kept me. But it's definitely being a challenge, and because it's I don't think any of us fit into what the Academy was created for, or what is expected. And I think us being PhD students, women and women of color in PhD studies, it challenges every structure, everything, both in the academy and the church, of the conventions about womanhood, about so many things, And so I think it's been, I know it's been an uphill battle, and it's been a constant wrestling back and forth, and it's been a constant, as Ali was saying, deconstructing of some of the values that I had or had been in a sense, imposed on me to be able to confront some of those words and then get to where I am right now.
Thank you, Yolanda. I think as hard as it is to hear of these specific experiences, right? I think it's needed to name them in order to, to name them, to confess them. Victoria, would you like to share with us some challenges that you've had as a Latina in these spaces?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the first things that I can say was and like Yolanda, Duke for me was also one of those first experiences of like, oh my goodness, what is this world? I did not know anything about this world. As a young kid, obviously I read a lot. I thought I knew a lot of words, but you really start to see the disparity come out when you're in a space like that, and you realize how kind of at a disadvantage you are from people who may have had different upbringings or different type of privilege growing up that one didn't have. So one of the things I thought was interesting that was a challenge was actually learning or the not knowing how to navigate the administrative or bureaucratic process of it. And what I mean by that is, I think being Latina or being a Latinx person, you kind of inherit this certain relationship to authority. So what I mean by that is authority is distance from you. You honor authority, you respect authority. So for me, when I would hear different people in those PhD panel mentor things talking about get close to your professor and make sure that you're building a relationship so you can get a letter, and just very simple things like that, I had no idea where to even begin with something like that. So I would see some of my peers before the professor even told us he or she could be called by their first name, many of my peers were already calling them by their first name. And for me, I'm like, you don't do that. Like, their doctor or their professor so-and-so before they allow you to call them their first name. And even when they did allow you to call them by their first name, I still felt like it was wrong, because you don't do that. You respect and you honor their title, their authority. So I had to learn how to figure out how to navigate even what it looked like to have a relationship with a professor, especially when most of them were white. So I really clung to a lot of the professors who were people of color that often were a bit more open to, or at least were aware that that might be a barrier that people of color in the academy would have to approaching a person of authority in the academy. So learning that was already a huge struggle. So I would really look at my other peers and see them interacting like nothing with the professors, and I'm like, how do you do that without being rude? How do I do that without crossing some sort of authority boundary? So having to learn that was really difficult. And like, that some of these things sound dumb, but I think like being there in the space, you realize that there's so much cultural knowledge that you don't have, that you show up and you're just kind of expecting things to be a certain way, and then they're not. Apart from also the culture shock of moving to a brand new state. So growing up in Southern California my whole life, brown people were everywhere. They were on the corner selling elotes and raspados and all the stuff. And they were in my church, filling the church, and immigrant communities were all over the place. And then going to another state where they were in hidden enclaves. And I remember specifically one moment where I literally took my laptop and went to do homework in a taco shop because I wanted the noise. I wanted to smell the smells. I wanted to hear the Spanish in the background like I was used to growing up. And it was one of those things that they're so small, but they really add up. And they really kind of taint the experience of, and they kind of remind you, you're not home. You're not where you're supposed to be. And also things like, just microaggressions that are micro, but the more of them that you get, they turn into macro. So things like, wearing apparel of the school you go to and getting things like, oh, did you get that at the Goodwill? Because you don't really go there. And it's like, okay, so you start to have to, on the one hand, you don't want to get upset because then that takes up your whole mental bandwidth and then you can't focus on the work that you need to do. On the other hand, why do I have to face these things every day? So it's really that struggle of trying to learn new ways of being. Also, as a woman, the constant apologizing that we're conditioned to do in emails or to the professor. I'm so sorry. Sorry for this comment. Sorry, if I could just say something. So retraining myself to not apologize for my existence in that space. Still learning that to this day. So another huge thing. And also, I think the way that the system renders motherhood and career so challenging. So almost like you have to pick one or the other. And I have very, personal experiences of when I did get pregnant in my first year of my PhD, which already probably shot myself in the foot there. But I remember specifically feeling like I'm going to get kicked out. No one's going to take me seriously. I'm no longer seen as ambitious. And I would wear bigger clothes just to hide the fact that, I was carrying a child and therefore I'm less of a scholar. And this isn't something that was so much said to me as was kind of implied within the department. And so already kind of having to pioneer this new way of existing where maybe this is a possible route for ambitious women in the academy, that perhaps you can't have everything, but this is also something that you can do. And being a woman in the academy can look this way as well. So there's so many things that I think I faced that were challenging. And even now as I adjunct here and there, when I'm teaching, just the various things that a woman has to do to make herself an authority in the space. So putting on, a blazer and making sure that students call you by a certain title so that you already kind of establish that you're the authority in the room, and then still being seen as, or still getting on evaluations, she was very nice as opposed to what I was teaching. So there's just so many things that I think have made it so challenging, that have made me want to quit multiple times, almost every day. And like Yolanda said, many tears, but, continue pressing on and ultimately trying to break down those things that make it so challenging for the people that are coming behind us. So.
Thank you, Victoria. So many of these things seem small, but they're actually pretty big because, you carry them over and over again. Like you were saying, they're pretty big challenges. Ali, would you like to share some of these challenges with us?
I think I already am. I am in la lucha, in the struggle. It is so painful to hear all of these experiences be articulated and to know that I've experienced them myself in variant degrees. And I am particularly, like, this is where it makes sense that my program is called Religion, Psychology, and Culture, because as Yolanda and Victoria were so effortlessly able to name like all of the social ways in which the erasure of identity is happening, I think I was less aware of it, even though they were happening. Why does that happen? Because when you come in as a 5-year-old daughter to undocumented Mexican parents, erasure of identity becomes safety. Erasure of identity is the way that you protect. It is a matter of survival. And so my experience in the academy was very much just this intrapsychic experience of just observing what is happening, what is going on within myself, what is changing, what is hurting, what is, nagging, what is pressing up against me. And so while I was aware of all these things, like Victoria, you mentioned, like how you address a professor. And for me, until this day, even with all of my clinical training, when I go in, whether it's a patient's room or it's a white male affluent professor, everything inside me just like shrivels. Because that is the one person that can get you kicked out of the country, right? Like, so you are reared into these ideas that are very real. They're not just ideas, they're realities. I should correct that. So it took longer. And in an era of fact check, I should mention earlier, I said that the Adventist Church made their statement against women's ordination in 2005. That's incorrect. It was 2015. So for me, with all of my training and the titles that I had been able to finally acquire, which is now I have an identity because of my access into education that is on the backs of my parents still, right? It took having these titles and then for this notice to come in for me to realize there is a problem with me being a woman. You know, like it just had not sunk in that way, because you are trained for survival to not pay attention to these things. You just have to find a way to make it back home, to continue going to church, and to be the best person that you can, right? And so this erasure of identity, the way that I guess was experiencing it in the classroom, is that there's also the lack of representation and erasure of histories, right? So you have a syllabus, so you have the absence of faculty, the absence of readings, the absence of spaces where Latinx community members are present, and it does something to you. It absolutely makes you feel like why are you even here? You know, it's not that you can't hang, it's not that you don't have anything to say, you know, it's not that you don't represent your community even, but when the syllabus doesn't afford a space for you to do it until maybe, hopefully, maybe at the end of the semester, when everyone is taxed and exhausted, you get the one article, you know, maybe there's some space there, but not being able to have peers even to talk and process the material that you're being presented with, it does something to you, especially because as you're seeking for your own language to articulate your experience, you're picking up different tools, you're picking up histories that are not yours. And then you have to prove to them, I know your history. And then somehow in the overload of this academic doctoral program, you have to find and carve space to find out about your history, right? Add to it that you're Protestant, and there's probably even less in Latinx and Hispanic worlds for us to tap into. It's not absent, but it's, you know, less. And so it's a big challenge. If doctoral programs are innately taxing on mind, body, soul, spirit, and it's all the more so for Latinx women who have to etch out time to learn more and find resources some way, somehow. A second part of this intrapsychic experience is knowing, you have this unnamed knowing, and I think we've mentioned it here in earlier questions, that by virtue of what you're learning through every reading, through every course, through every semester, there is this chasm, there is this space between you and your survival community, such as the church, such as your family, such as friends back home. And you're just separating, and there's this distance between us now. And you live with this knowing that you can't go back and be the exact same person that you was, because you know, not more in the sense of number, but you know different, you know other things that your family has not been a part of, that your church hasn't, you know, deconstructed and constructed with you. And so you come back, you go through these layers of transformation, and you didn't go through it with those that are so formative. And living with that, knowing that, it then begs the question again of like, then where do I belong? Where is the space? Where is my platform then, as I am integrating all of these realities of my lived experience, right? And so that's been my challenge of being in addition to everything named, I wanted to uplift also that intrapsychic space, that psychological harm that we also have to heal ourselves from. It's heavy.
Yeah, Ali, thank you for bringing attention to that. Thinking of like the psychological wounds, the psychological heaviness that it causes, I do want to give a pause to say that, and to say, when we talk about the challenges, you know, that Latina women face in these spaces, when we talk about all these little ways that remind you constantly that you carry in your body, and you kind of have learned to keep going and not like completely think about them so much, because it will just, you know, take so much time and probably destroy you, to every day be thinking about how have this hurt me. It's an experience that even as you're sharing, I feel it in my body, right? Like I feel that the stress, I feel the coming up. And so I want to mention that, to say this is not just an abstraction that we're talking about when we share these things. This is an actual experience that feels like heaviness in each of our bodies. I just want to say that. And yeah, as you were all talking, I was thinking, perhaps there's obviously probably not a complete answer to this, and you're probably still trying to figure it out, right? How have you survive, or how do we then survive these spaces? Or how have you, perhaps there's not a complete answer to that, but like how have you found ways so far learning how to survive it, or perhaps more learning how to thrive in it despite the things happening, or in the face of things like these affecting us every day? And we talk about doing things en conjunto, right? And so I think about that too, just like how do we survive then these spaces en conjunto? How have you found those spaces of rest that have allowed you to keep going? What works in your life to be able to, yeah, empower you to keep the walk? Victoria, do you want to start?
Sure. I think this question, even now in the time of COVID, right? Like, how are we even surviving now in virtual spaces like this? It's been tough. I think a variety of different things, and obviously one of the main ways for myself personally is community, just flat out, just community. My church, my family, my partner, who has been 1,010% supportive, stays at home with the baby while I study. So it's really a tag team effort there. So there are, sometimes the survival mechanism is different every day. Sometimes it looks like turning my phone off for that day, when really I really can't escape the news because it affects us so deeply. It's a privilege to just turn off what's going on in the world, but there are some days, certain days, where I just absolutely need to do that. There are other days where I need to go back and read fiction. I grew up loving, I could read through 300-page like novels, and I loved it. And then I got to the academy and it just like kind of squashed that love of reading. So sometimes survival that day looks like reading fiction again, and reading a story, and reading, novelas or whatever it may be. Other days it looks like group chats. Group chats for me have been so empowering in a way, where you can have other people that can cheese mad with you and can complain with you, but also can uplift one another, as we're all going through similar times and through similar struggles. So I've been really lucky to find, in every educational institution that I go to, I've always been, I don't know if it's divine something, but it's the way that I feel there's always a community that is created in every educational institution that I go to. And at Duke, it was, La Unión Latina, all of my friends who I found there, that truly was God, where I don't know how we all came together, but that was God. We found each other, and we were from such different places, different countries of origin, even different ways that we spoke Spanish. But when we came together and kind of lived into the struggle together, it just felt that much lighter. And currently at USC, since I am back home, I know that that's something that not a lot of people have. So I purposely selected my doctoral program to be back at home, because I really couldn't handle, I knew I wouldn't be able to survive being so far away from home, in a different culture, in a different place, without having the support of my family in my specific case. So yeah, there are days where survival looks different. And the times of COVID, it looks like starting to meditate again, and starting to do things out of the norm that I stopped doing once I started my doctoral program. Because a lot of times you have good habits and you have things that you enjoy, and then PhD starts and those all go out the window, because you feel guilty when you're not studying, and then you feel guilty for studying too much, and then it's just all the guilt all the time, especially for a perfectionist like myself. So having to purposely interrupt myself and try to find those moments of joy and solace in the everyday again, that kind of helped keep me somewhat sane and grounded. So those are a couple of my things that I use to cope every day.
Thank you, Victoria. I love, David, what you share on the chat. Chisme saves lives, or chisme is survival. It's so important. One can write so many papers about that. Yolanda, would you mind sharing?
Yeah, I echo some of the things that Victoria mentioned, especially the group chats. Those have been my saving grace in many ways. And also for me, it has been traveling or having friends travel. So I've actually, so using each other or giving each other opportunities where we can see each other. Like last year, I was at Ali's place for a couple of days, and just having that experience of being able to share experiences, or having friends come and stay maybe 2 or 3 days, and maybe I had to go to class that day, but at least when I came back to my apartment in Dallas, they were there. In the time of COVID, it has looked like moving to Austin and leaving my apartment in Dallas because my parents are in Austin. And so coming back to my parents' house after 5 years. And that I've been fortunate, and I think that has been said and echoed by Ali and Victoria as well, that my parents have continued to sustain me through this. And so when I decided that I wanted to do a PhD, they left Puerto Rico. And there were other reasons, Hurricane Maria, so many other things. But they decided to leave Puerto Rico and specifically find their way to Texas so they could be here for me. And so in the time of COVID, it has looked like coming back home and just being here. And I even get emotional talking about it because the fact that I can wake up in my house with my parents and eat Puerto Rican food, which is not something that is common, that was common in North Carolina, and it's not common in Texas because Puerto Ricans are all in the upper East Coast or in Florida. That's not coming here like that. That has been definitely been part of my survival. For me, my community is still mostly back in Puerto Rico, so it has looked like a lot of FaceTime and a lot of WhatsApp calls and texts and voices and voice messages to be able to stay connected. And then for me in particular, I know it's not the experience of many in the academy, but I'm not really that shy. So it has looked a lot like forcing myself to deconstruct some of the values that were mentioned before about belittling myself or making myself smaller or trying to give respect, and without being disrespectful, sometimes saying a couple of things when they need to be said in order to ensure the survival of especially my peers of color in the program. So it has looked like challenging authority sometimes. It has looked like doing things like this and being honest about my experience. It has looked like advising other scholars in the making and telling them, look, this is what the school is like, this is what the people you need to be looking out for, and these are the people that you can trust. Because chisme, like David said, like really saves lives. And I have been saved by the few people in community that I've had who have warned me and told me things and been 100 with me. And that's what I try to do as well. But it has been essentially looking for community. I echo Victoria has been getting outside of academic reading and just reading things for pleasure again. For me, Netflix shows, I love movies and things like that. So I recently started rewatching Harry Potter from the beginning, and I watched, I'm starting to watch Avengers from the beginning. And so looking into other things that I like that don't have to do with my work. And so that has been the way that I've been able to stay alive and give myself the space needed to survive. And it has taken a lot of unlearning because I don't know for others, but the experience for me is that you don't ask for help because then you'll let people know that you're weak. And so it has also been learning to ask for help and say, look, I can't do that, or I need an extension. Like I think in all of my academic career, I had ever asked for one extension, and I feel super guilty about it. But it has taken learning to do that and to admit that I'm human and that and to know that if those opportunities are there for my peers, I should demand them for myself as well. And if I'm seeing other people ask for them and get all of these exceptions, then it should be my right, and I shouldn't be scared to say, look, this person had one, I should have one too, and I should get one too. And then obviously looking for spaces. So for me, the HTI, the Hispanic Theological Initiative, academic spaces that also center our voices and our experiences has been key. And not only finding that community, but specifically finding the community within the academy, even though we're not in the same schools, where our kids just text or call and be like, hey, I'm having this experience. And they can say back, oh yeah, that happened to me my first year. Like, this is one thing you can do. So it's been a mix of things, and like Victoria said, it looks different every day, but it has to be intentional in it, and I've had to do it. I put it as my priority, even be beyond my work, to be able to survive.
Thank you, Yolanda. I feel like I see in what you share and Victoria share the importance of knowing what you need, right? Like you both knew that in order to survive these programs and thrive in the face of all the challenges, you needed to keep family nearby. You need to keep those kind of connections close to you physically. And so it was important for you to emphasize that. Yeah, and I love how both of you have highlighted again, just like the whether that's like through group chats or, you know, actual like personal gatherings before COVID, like again, the importance of chisme. And I love Dr. De La Rosa that you wrote in the text that we can see that as popular wisdom circles. I feel like in my experience, when we face so many of these small and big aggressions, then, you know, these wisdom circles, these chisme circles can be space to just be like, déjame contarte lo que me pasó, right? Like, no vas a creer lo que me acaban de decir. Like, you know, there's a way of like releasing that there with other people, and we can draw so much strength from that. Ali, would you like to share as well some of your survival ways that you survive these spaces?
They have named all of the techniques, but really it's just this mode of trying to find what stabilizes you. The first thing that popped in my head when you asked the question was cumbia. Anything, honestly, they're just like, and I'm not even the greatest dancer, but music, creative outlets, art, do-it-yourself projects, anything that could allow me to just tap out of the constant question theory, dealing with death, dying, suffering. You know, like I feel like my mind is always going with these questions. Netflix no longer works for me because it raises all these theological questions. And so I look for projects really to get me engaged in a space where I don't have to think about what I do day to day in the academy. That has helped immensely. Even also learning the balance of like, for as important as core to my being as family is, I have learned also that I have to navigate the wisdom circles because sometimes knowing too much about what's happening and not being able to be there is difficult. And so finding a balance in that, and just what comes in has been really important. Gosh, I love my weekends and finding like the local, now COVID has complicated everything, but there's being in Nashville, it's hard. It's really hard to find really good Mexican food, you know, and yes, I can cook it, but it's so nice when it's just there. And so I go, there's Belen's where, you know, you walk into this store and it's got all of the things, you know, she's selling Per Plus shampoo to the left, there's elote and ice cream to the right, there's piñatas at the top, and right around the corner, you have all the caldo in the world. So I look forward to the, also as Victoria named, like the aromas, the spaces, the sounds, the Spanish, the people that just fill me back up, and it sustains me, it stabilizes me, it lets me know we're here and I'm not the only one. And that's all I could say is it's just finding those spaces that remind me of our culture, our traditions, our language, our foods, and it's sustaining. I should say I also have a 3 and a 4-year-old niece and nephew, and FaceTime. Oh my gosh.
Ali, thank you so much for mentioning cumbia, because that is so important, at least to me as well. The dancing, the moving of your body. And what I've realized lately too is that when I listen, I'm Peruvian, so I listen to Peruvian cumbia a lot, like David as well, yeah, chicha, as he mentioned. And I've realized that like a lot of the lyrics actually deal with really tragic stuff. But so I feel like when I'm entering into this dancing space with cumbia, I'm not actually putting away, I think, the heaviness, I'm actually engaging with it, but also I'm moving my body to it. Like, you know, so it's both like an engaging in a different kind of way that I think leads to a lot of freedom. Anyway, that's all to say. Thank you so much for bringing that. I love cumbia myself. I'm not much of a dancer either, but I love it so much. Thank you all for sharing. I think I can draw so much from each of the practices in your life that you have found in how to survive these challenges and the challenges found in these spaces. It's already 6:23, so I would just like to switch it really quick. Switch gears a little bit and just one last question. I know there's a lot of, we're gonna also be sharing this conversation with younger folks, with younger people that might be thinking about a call possibly either to the academy or even to the university, right, as undergrads. As they discern these, what would you tell them, or kind of what would be your advice to them and your recommendations, right, to these younger people that are just discerning their call, or perhaps have some inclining or desire to enter the university spaces? What would you tell them? Victoria, would you like to start?
Yeah, what would I tell them? Aside from don't do it, no, I'm kidding. No, it's worth it. It's worth it. Well, it's easy for me to say. I'm barely at the beginning of this program, but I think it's very important to try not to tie your work to your worth. And I say try because it's very difficult to do that, especially as, Latinx people who a lot of the times especially in this neoliberal capitalist society in which we live, where our labor is tied to our worth, what we can produce is tied to how much we are valued in society. So being intentional about breaking that. So as Ali was saying, the weekends for me are sacred, and every day I feel guilty for not working on the weekend, but I think to myself, I am not just a machine with constant output. So being realistic about that is really important. I think also being realistic about the financial aspect. I know this isn't really popular to talk about in doctoral circles, because the life of the mind is priceless and all that, yes, but also we need to eat. So I think for me it was very important to, when I was searching for doctoral programs, to be honest about what I needed in the long term. So looking for programs, analyzing the stipend. This is not to say that, following that passion is not important. It's very much important and it should be there. I think passion is what carries you really through the program, but being realistic about the financial aspect for me was key. Thinking about, my partner, my family, what I was gonna be doing, especially with the state of the academy right now. Sounds really doom and gloom, but I think the more realistic you are, the better you can save yourself from a lot of unnecessary, perhaps, stress. And I know this is not the same for everyone, so I'm not pretending to make this experience normative, but just if anyone is considering applying for doctoral programs, just understanding what all comes with that. Another thing I think I would recommend would be to network with other graduate students of color. So like Yolanda was saying, HTI has been so invaluable for me, even though unfortunately USC is not part of that. We're working on it, but that network is an amazing space where that other people are can at least understand your experiences. So networking. Another thing is to do your best to break the norms of how we've been socialized in this space. So for example, going to things like conferences, or even just presenting yourself in the space. I think Yolanda can relate to this. I would show up at school sometimes with like giant hoops and like red lipstick. And I would always be like, okay, I look too ethnic. I look way too different. I already stick out like a sore thumb and I'm just making it worse on myself. But I think I would have to do it intentionally, even though I am a shy person, but it was kind of for myself to remind myself that it's okay to look a certain way, and I don't have to try to socialize myself to look like what the academy deems as professional. So those are just a couple of things. I mean, there's definitely, I know I want to also hear from Yolanda and Ali, but I think the network part is very key, and also just finding the people that you can surround yourself with that are going to contribute to your success throughout the process. So it's really just not, and I think us as Latinas, more than anyone in Latinx communities, I always tell my parents, when I get that degree, God willing, in a few years, it might as well have everybody's name on it, because I did not do this alone. I had people who watched my kids. I had people who were praying for me, or I had people who were encouraging me, or, it's really a community, what's the word, a community journey that we're all going on. Even though I'm the one doing it, so many people have poured into my life during this time. So that's some advice that I would give for younger people, or even just people considering academic careers for their futures.
Thanks, Victoria. Yolanda, would you like to share next?
Sure. I think first of all, I would like to say, and this can be a little shocking to hear, but academic is not the only way to go. I think there's also a really strong sort of like, you have to do this. If it's not for you, that's okay. And there's also value in other career tracks. However, if this is what you want to do, I think I echo what Victoria said. Networking is important, but I would like to sort of put a little note on that and say, make sure that the people that you're networking with are going to be honest with you. I think there's a really popular saying in the Black American community where they say that all of your skin folk is not your kinfolk. And unfortunately, my experience has been that not all of the Latinos in the academy are really for you. And that's really sad to say, but it's very true. So make sure that the people that you're connecting with, whether it be graduate students, faculty, staff, whoever, are going to be really honest about the good, but especially the bad, and that are going to be able to accompany you through the journey. I think also what Victoria mentioned, funding is essential. Make sure you search for funding and explore all of those parts, because you have to live. And with that, something that I didn't consider for myself and that presented a challenge that I didn't think it was going to, and it has taken getting used to, it's the climate, the weather. You might not think it's that important, but make sure that when you're choosing schools and you're finding where to go, think about the weather. Think about who are the communities that are there. Are you going to see other Latinos around you? Is that space going to be completely white? Because it might not sound like it's so important, but it definitely makes a difference. And when you're dealing with so many other things that just the academic demand brings, those can be the things that make you or break you. So for me, I moved to two places, first North Carolina and then Texas, where there's no Puerto Ricans. So I don't see my people every day. And it's an effort that I have to go through great lengths to be able to find my people, because yes, I love the Latino community, and yes, I identify, but of course we are all different. And the Puerto Rican community, even just with Espanol, a lot of my bad experiences have been with people policing my Spanish, and saying that the Spanish that I speak is not the proper way to speak it. And so that, make sure that you think about all the other dimensions of your life beyond the academy, which is essentially important. And then mentoring, find people that will mentor you, whether it's in the church or in the academy. Find people and don't be scared to reach out and ask. I know that speaking for me, I don't have the same challenges as other people, porque yo soy bien presentada. Like I'm not too shy, so I don't get scared, but it's still a little intimidating. I mean, I still have had the experience where I don't want to ask, or I don't want to say, or but we don't know. Like Victoria was sharing it earlier, like even the processes of admission, of applying to a scholarship, like all these things are mostly unknown to a lot of us, or even if they are, we come from other contexts where it wasn't the same, or the expectations are not the same. So look for programs, look for things, whether in your denomination or in your school or in your community, that could help you through all of this process. But make sure that you're speaking to these people, and make sure that you're dreaming big. As we say all of this, it can sound really daunting, but I also want to emphasize that it is possible, and that it is always a source of pride for me to continue to see people like Ali and Victoria and Alma and all of these people who are in the academy, who are fighting every day, and each and every day there's more of us. And I think that as we build this community, I don't want to speak for everyone else, but I still haven't found a lot of people that are not. One of our goals is always to bring more people in and make sure that we kick the fences down, so it's not as hard for others as it is for us. So yeah, build community, think about the environment, make sure that you're finding people who are honest with you. And yeah, and like Victoria said, keep in mind that what you do and all of this production is not where your worth is at, and that whether you have PhD at the end of your name or not doesn't mean that you're any less valuable or more valuable.
Thank you, Yolanda. Ali?
What more could I possibly add? Yolanda, I hate that you get this like policing over Spanish, because I think que cuando mi español mexicano se encuentra con el tuyo caribeño, it's a glorious thing. So let's just put that out there. I really love that. But you're so right that like this cautiousness about who we let into our network is so real. And the one thing that I learned is sometimes that I have experienced, like, you start feeling some distance with people that you don't necessarily need to be skeptical because outside there are people saying, oh, there's only 2 Latinas here. So naturally you're both competing, and that's something also that I've learned to like watch out for. Sometimes it doesn't come from within as much as from outside. And so watching that, the relational experience too, I think I mentioned, of like you start feeling the separation. So for those of you that you feel this call into the academy, to just know that it's going to happen, that it's very real, and be aware of it. And so, and with that, let's also take the stigma away from counseling. Mentors are great, and don't limit yourself just to one. It's not just your advisor, it's not just your professor. It can be them plus the church plus a trusted friend. Like, you can have more than one mentors. I had one for years that was just my prayer partner. Like, that was his function, and it was a beautiful and very needed and important part of my my sustainability in this process as well. I also think about, there's also counseling on campus, also, like, normalize that as well. Like, it's, my peers and I, like, yeah, I've gone to my therapy session. It's part of what we speak about. So that's also there. I would offer too journaling. It's not by design as much as by who we are, that like, if we're going to talk about the academy and theology, we have to talk about the church. We have to talk about family communities. We have to talk about our culture. As Latinos, we don't separate these things. They're all just this stirred up in us. It's who we are. And so it's so important to write down and remember where you were, what you are currently thinking about. Write it down, even if it's just a bullet point, but keep that one journal, because we have this responsibility, I feel, and it's shown as important in this conversation, to return to our communities. It's not just about, we got the degree, now we're a prominent professor somewhere, director of some place, and we have forgotten about our communities and where we come from, right? The goal is that if we're going to truly transform society, that we bring back this knowledge, we integrate also with the knowledge that is already there. So let's make that clear too, right? But sometimes when you are in a space for a prolonged period of time, the language, the ideas, where you were, you can tend to forget. So write it down so that when you go back to these communities, oh, that's where I was then. This is currently still where my community's at. And so how can I integrate what I've learned now? I offer that also as just something that's really important. And I don't think I have anything. Oh, one last thing. If only we would take like affirmation as deeply as we take criticism, we'd be stronger for it. Because somehow I think maybe it's our perfectionist spirit, maybe it's this weight of like, you have to do well, you have to excel, you're first gen, the only one in your family that's doing this in this century, whatever. There's all these pressures that we hold. And so we take critique more seriously, we work with it more, but also there's been along the way a lot of places of affirmation. And I feel like, let that sink in. Sometimes it comes to you verbally, sometimes it comes through an image, sometimes it comes through a moment. Like, let it sink in and pay attention to the affirming spaces throughout this journey, and let nothing and no one steal your joy for the call. This was really difficult when you have parents who in their protective mode are saying things like no mucha letra, right? Like, don't become that, don't forget this, like, just get. My third year in undergrad, I was ready to go home, and my dad said, great, when should I pick you up? And so you're going to get pressure and feel like you cannot do this. Like, there are resources available, tap into them. Let nothing, let no one get in the way of, if God has made this call, God will walk us through it. God will remain faithful.
Thank you, Ali. So yeah, this has been such a fruitful conversation. Thank you to the three of you. I feel already so strengthened, and will definitely be rewatching this video to keep strengthening myself for the journey ahead, and sharing it with everybody I know, really. And so we just wanted to open it up briefly. I know it's already almost 6:40. If anyone has any questions that you would like to ask, we can spend some minutes where the panelists can answer those questions. We'll give some time now for people to kind of gather themselves and think about what they've heard and raise some questions if they have any.
Yes, Catherine, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm eager to ask questions like raising my hand. Thank you so much, Yolanda, Victoria, and Ali for opening your life and your heart to us and sharing about your experience. You know, the three of you share how you have experienced the ugly of the church and of each one of your denominations. And I'm just wondering, but you decide to stay there. And so I would like to hear more about that. Could you share with us why you decided to stay and how do you reconcile the beautiful and the ugly parts of the church that you have to experience, all the time? And as you know, the United Methodist Church and United Methodists, and a lot of people right now in the United Methodist Church are discerning if they stay or they leave. And so I would like to hear from your experiences. Why do you decide to stay and how are you reconciling the beauty and the ugly parts, the beautiful and the ugly parts of the church?
I think there's many reasons. There's both sort of strategic reasoning. If I am completely honest, there's some motivation that comes just from the connection that the United Methodist Church has in terms of funding and opportunity. I'll be honest, but there's also the reason. So I'm a fourth generation Methodist from both sides of my family. Since my great grandparents, most people in my family, even if they haven't remained Methodist, started in the Methodist Church, and so there's sort of a familiar legacy there. And I think one of the things that has helped me understand me staying and other people leaving is once I was in a talk similar to this where somebody said that in the fight for justice and truth, equality and all these things, not everybody has the same role, right? And so some people leave and that's their part to leave. But to me, I think God has called me to stay because I although everything around me doesn't look good, I think there's still the possibility of change. And I think there's still the possibility that as we see all of these sinister things happening, we also see people rising and wanting to do something different for the church and to make something different. And I think I'm not a Methodist because of the United Methodist Church as an institution. I think I am a Methodist because I have read my doctrine and looked at the discipline, and because the things that outside of what people practice it, the thing that the Methodist doctrine is, and even in its beginnings, what it was as a movement inside of the Anglican Church, are things that help me exist. You know, it's the idea of the quadrilateral. It's the constant evaluation of ourselves. It's the self-awareness. It's all of these things that are within our doctrine that don't necessarily mean that we see them in practice every day. But my sort of affiliation is not to the institution. It's to that doctrine that works for me, and it's to God that has called me in it. And so as the Methodist Church has formed me, I think I have a lot of it to think of it. And so I think in my particular experience and my calling, it has been, so my role is to stay and to keep pushing and to keep resisting and to keep saying that this whole idea that the church is dead and that there's no hope and that we all need to leave, especially for young people, it doesn't need to be the truth, and that the 1% of the select few shouldn't be the people who get to decide what our church is going to be like. And so I think that's why I have stayed. It hasn't been easy at all, and I've wanted to leave, and I wanted to take my family with me, who are also involved in ecclesial positions and leadership positions in the church. But I think it's to each his own, their own. And to me, it has been a calling to believe that another future is possible, and that me pushing and that me having the chisme chats with some of my youth from Marcha or things like that, when there's only 5 of us or 6 of us, has something to say and has something to do with what could be with the Methodist Church.
To answer that question as well, Alma, I think one of the reasons why I am still here, or even one of the reasons why I'm studying what I'm studying, which is, biblical studies, is because of my huge concern for biblical literacy. And I think one of the best places that I can serve in that way is in the Pentecostal tradition. The elevation of experience can sometimes be very harmful. And I think I have this drive in me to remain, to help bring with at risk of, I don't want to sound like I'm going to be the savior of this church or my specific church, but I think it's important for me, specifically in my own personal life, it's important for me to stay and to do what I can to increase biblical literacy in that way in my own specific home church. And on top of that, I think seeing the influx of young people asking similar questions that I was asking, and I didn't really have anyone to bounce those questions off of, so which is why I went to school. So I think that as I see a lot more youth in my specific home church questioning or asking ideas about race, or just being more concerned with issues of justice overall, and that not being reflected or talked about from the pulpit, I think it's important for me to be that sounding block for them. A lot of our youth are more educated now, and are you talk about the generational divide between parents, from immigrant from different countries, and then their children, who are, most of whom are born here and who have a completely different experience, and who are asking different questions, and who are concerned with different things. And so many are leaving. And so I think it's important for me in my own personal case to remain present and to be a sounding board for a lot of these young people who have already approached me with issues of, well, I heard this, but I believe this, so what do you think? And I think for me, it's been helpful to be there and know that I'm being for someone what I wish I would have had when I was younger.
I can quickly jump in and just be very brief, but I feel like, where am I supposed to go? I think like all of us represent different churches, and we're going to find the good, the bad, the ugly in each space, right? And I love what you were saying, Yolanda, too. Like, we are who we are because of what we've come to believe, and not necessarily how people act upon what they've come to believe, right? We're human beings. We're subject to make mistakes, but what keeps me hanging on in this community is the same thing that keeps me hanging on, in other spaces of my life and relationships. We say the church, but it's not just a building, it's a group of people, right? And it is my core belief that we don't give up on people. And so if we are framed in these spaces and we're able to pick up on something that's missing, here's our resistance, right? Like, here's why we stay. Lies our hope, even, that we can walk into a better tomorrow.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Yolanda. Thank you, Victoria, for responding to that question. I wanted to give Damien, sorry, I'm pronouncing that right, Damien? Would you like to formulate your question if you're kind of thinking through it?
Yes, I have to talk it out because sometimes it's just about letting it.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I was thinking, in listening to all of you, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I mean, tremendously valuable for all of us to hear, and definitely for the world. Definitely, I'm thinking about the discreditation of work and the feminization of labor. And I'm thinking of how, how do you tackle when people are like, that's interdisciplinary, that's pluralist, that's all these words that mean like too much in the academy. And when it comes in, it's an inherent part of our identity as Latinx people. And when you walk with pluralism embedded in your being, how do you sparse that out when it comes to your own labor, right? I guess that's why it's something that I need to talk out, because it's embodied in the sense of, how do you tackle being credited for your work, right?
Yolanda, would you like to?
Yeah, let me quickly disconnect because my
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'll say something quickly. For me, that looked like looking for a program that will let me do it. And I know that's not the same experience for everybody, especially depending on what field you're interested in. But for me, I tried to look for a program who already had an element of interdisciplinary work embedded in it, even if it wasn't in the way that I'm doing it or that we are experiencing it, so that I could get away with some of the things that I couldn't otherwise. And so my first step was that, just finding a program that would allow me to do that. And then I think second, um, I don't even know that I can give you a solid answer, because mostly I think it takes a lot of courage and a lot of you putting the value in your work beyond the comments that you're receiving, which is a really hard task. Because you won't find a lot of people who will say, oh, this is what academic work should look like, or this is the language that you should be using. But it takes then you having the courage to say, like, no, there's worth in this work, and this work has something to say, even if it's not saying it in the terms that you are expecting it to say it. And so I think it's a combination of making sure that you make the decisions in terms of strategically and where you put your body in the academic world. I think it's you having the courage to put that value in it yourself, even if you're not receiving it. And I think it's also looking for the people who are gonna be on board with you. So there's not a lot of us, but there's a few around. And so it's a combination of being strategic, of being brave, and of safeguarding yourself as well, but mostly in believing that there's something that has to be said in the way that you're imagining it to be said, and that there's no need for you to reframe it or say in a different way for it to be considered academic, which is, I realize, a really hard thing to do, but it's what comes to mind.
Thank you, Yolanda. If Ali or Victoria have anything to say to the question, feel free to share your thoughts.
The strategy is so key in all of this, like not only finding that institution, but also how you engage in dialogue with faculty members in your area and support groups. And something that I have found too, it's like, your question reminds me a lot of like what they tell us for the dissertation process, right? The fun comes later. First, you have to prove that you know where the field is and that you can sustain an argument for chapters on end, you know, like, and we are the committee, right? And so we have to go through this hoop. And I find that in the same way, like we also have to, this is why this conversation is so important too, to be Latina in the academy, like, or Latinx representing person, or any minoritized being in this space. You have to do twice, if not three times the amount of work to prove yourself to them, and then bring in who you are in these plural ways of thinking. One way that I found also is like, as you learn to speak their language, you speak with them through it. So for example, my two minors are women, gender, and sexuality, as well as Latino and Latina studies, right? These are extensions of the divinity school. And so when I bring together material through practical theology and also Latino, like cultural studies, everything that I learned in the other two departments, then it makes sense, right? So there's that, but it is, it's strategy, it's networking and support. And most of all, I really want to emphasize the word that Yolanda used, which is courage. Believe that what you have to bring, what you have to offer, and you are bringing in who you are is important. And it is also a matter of like critical engagement with the issues that we're dealing with as well.
Thank you, Ali. Yeah, so we're running out of time, so we want to make sure, you know, we actually were thinking this webinar would be an hour and a half, and we've run over that because this conversation is just so rich. For everybody that has registered for this, we will send a recording over to you. so that you make sure to share this with whoever you think will benefit from this. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panelists for your wisdom, for everything that your experiences that you shared with us. Each of us is gonna take these forever. I'm gonna take this. I'm gonna carry this forever in me. So yeah, we just wanna say thanks to all, and we'll see you next month for the Sumérgete in November with Daniel Camacho.
Gracias y un aplauso por todo lo que están haciendo. You're doing a great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.